Welcome to this episode of the Blue Lineage podcast series. This is our final episode of the Timeline series. Next week, we will have one bonus episode, and then we'll kind of have an outro or final discussion of the timeline, just kind of where things were left off. The timeline goes to 1985. Obviously, that was quite a long time ago, and we'll discuss a little bit why the timeline ends in 1985 today. But obviously, there's a lot of things that have happened since then. There can be a discussion of where music has gone since then, where it's going. We can get in a discussion of whether or not there are new genres that could be included on the timeline. Have we left this hip hop genre? I think overall we're still pretty steeped in the hip hop genre, in addition to the other genres that were on the timeline, modern versions of those genres. So that's, we can get into that discussion and also kind of just, see where we could take the podcast if that's where we decide to go. I really want to leave it up to all of you, the listeners. There's a lot of different ways that we can present this information, besides podcast form. And so really, we just wanted to nail down the timeline and kind of have that core structure in place and at least have that out and go from there, because the narrative that this timeline presents is a little bit different than the narratives that we commonly hear as far as the way it progresses, the lineage itself, how it progresses through time, and the inclusion of different cultural components and social components, and some of the artists that we don't necessarily hear, but were really the innovators of these various styles and genres. So that's where we'll go. But for now, we'll focus on this final episode. We've already talked pretty in depth about hip hop. We're already pretty deep into the hip hop movement. Really kind of left off still talking about block parties and how that has progressed into commercial hip hop now. And now we really get into some of the innovations and some of the artists that really turned hip hop into what we now know as hip hop or rap. And to start that off, we start with technology, an invention, which is very important. It's the Roland TR-808. And most of you who have listened to any record, and I'm sure listeners, especially listeners to this podcast, are going to be well familiar because this is pretty well known, very current. You still hear it in modern music. As far as it's really the original widely used programmable drum machine. It was created by Ikitaro Kakahashi, who is also known as the founder of Roland, which was in 1980. And it's kind of an interesting story just because, like a lot of things that we've talked about in this series, it was originally a failure commercially. The early drum machines developed by Roland really had families in mind. In the 1970s, the late 1970s is when they kind of first started producing them. And so the idea, since it was family oriented, was just to be able to produce rhythms, nothing geared toward professionals, where you're going to really make and produce albums and professional quality music. But the 808 came out, and that was the one that was intended for pros. But as you can imagine, when you're trying to enter an industry, a well-established industry, and you're kind of putting something out that was, at least initially for families, as you could almost think of as a toy. It's not going to necessarily break in right away. People are not going to have the skills or tools to use it, and so it might take a little bit. And especially with the TR-808, which used analog circuitry, and it had a lot of unique quirks, the components that they used. Um, because it was a failure, the original TR-808 is the only one that has those exact components and circuitry. Some of the later models, once it picked up, they tried to replicate it, but the hardcore producers and DJs will tell you that you can't replicate the original. Um, Only 12,000 were ever made between the years of 1980 and 1982, and then it was discontinued in 1983. So a very short window. Very few units. They're hard to find. Some people, of course, will say that the modern, of course, there's many drum machines that have been made since then, and even the ones that were made after the later replica models are just as good. Some will say, but there definitely is a um, uniqueness to the original, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But even though they weren't commercially successful, when you're talking about the wide range of the industry, so we're not talking about hip hop, we're just talking about, at this point, it's music is very international. And so we're talking about the international community adopting this. And when you think about the genres that would have adopted something like this at the time, when you think about disco and electronic music, that's kind of where you would think of it being initially geared. But it became pretty successful early in hip hop, because as we've talked about with DJ Kool Herc and some of these other early DJs, they were already very interested in altering and extending records, making the music their own, allowing it to become, the life of the party for these block parties and different, sessions that were going on. And the key to the TR-808 was the bass drum sound. And so right away, you're able to sort of, when you're extending records, altering records, and you're able to add a bass to really kind of draw that out and kind of make your own beats just from that before we even get to the sampling. That's a big game changer for these DJs. And then you add the ability to store samples. And as we discussed earlier, the break was one of the very early techniques, part of the art for DJs. And something like the TR-808 just opens up a whole new world of possibilities when you're able to do all these different things with the music and extend the beats and the break in the music. And one of the early adopters that we may or may not have heard of is Yellow Magic Orchestra, and that was probably one of the first first bands to adopt the TR-808. But as far as the American, one of the first American songs that you recognize it on would be Sexual Healing by Marvin Gaye. And so, as I was talking about before briefly, as far as the quirks that kind of make the Roland TR-808 unique, it was one of the key components was the transistors that they used. They're considered out of specification, but they were purchased by Roland, and they weren't faulty, but they had particular qualities that really the TR-8 has almost like a sizzling sound to it, which is kind of like one of those perfect imperfections where you kind of end up with an accident when you think about things like distortion, intentional distortion that you hear on tracks or guitarists and other songs. Those types of things, you kind of get that out of the TR-8, where it was an unintentional effect that really made it a unique sound for the time. And so the component was also known as as a 2SC828R, and that's just the key component that really gave the unique sounds. And so once those you know sort of quirky transistors and whatnot were all used up, that was it. And then the TR8 was discontinued. TR-808 was discontinued. And besides the lack of commercial success, that was the main reason why it was discontinued. And that's why it's been hard to replicate, because they have not ever been able to obtain those components and make another drum machine just exactly like the TR-808. So that's the bulk of what it is. I mean, you can really just scan around the internet, the archives, and find a bunch of different artists, modern, from the 80s till now, who still employ the TR-808. Of course, I think one of the most well-known records of recent times was probably Kanye West, when he used it for his album Heartbreaks and 808s. But you can also hear it on recent tracks like Drunken Love by Beyonce. And also, when you think about modern music, you can think of 808 Mafia. It's in the name. And they are really a core innovator of Atlanta's trap sound, as well as a lot of other producers using the TR-808 in that trap scene. So that is the TR-808. TR-808. I don't know why I have trouble saying that. It's just very simple. So next we'll go back to the artists, and we're going to start off with Funky 4+1. And Funky 4+1, they're a hip-hop group from New York, and their members were Jazzy Jeff, Sharon Green, also known as Chirac, DJ Breakout, Guy Williams, and Keith. And they were reportedly the first hip-hop group to get a record deal in 1977, and they were also the first hip-hop group to perform on national TV, and they were also the first hip-hop group to have a female member, Chirac, one of the great MCs. And some of this is kind of trivial, as we've already talked about. The first commercial hit was by Sugar Hill Gang, shortly followed by The Sequence with their hit in 1979. So although they were the first, they really didn't see success till a little bit later. And all of these records are kind of trivial to a certain extent, just because in the grand scheme of things, these records are all within that early span of hip hop, and it's kind of who came first, who was recognized first commercially, and it really kind of speaks more to the greater cultural movement that was going on, not necessarily that these particular individual acts were overly innovative individually. They're definitely contributing. The reason they're on the timeline is because they're some of the first, and they kind of set the tone in the commercial sector, and just with the early success of hip hop. But it's also just kind of one piece in this big cultural movement. As we talked about previously, in the club scene and the block parties, a lot of the stuff was kind of already developing, in the underground. So the fact that these different artists surfaced is very important, but it's also just important to remember that this is part of this whole hip hop culture that was going on. But their first commercial success was in the 1980s with That's a Joint, and that was when they performed on Saturday Night Live, which was the first time we saw a hip hop group perform on national TV. And that really ended them helped them, kind of catch fire, and they were asked after that to open up for Blondie, but Sylvia Robinson prevented them from doing so. And that's kind of one of those things that we've continued to talk about as far as this interesting disconnect and situation where we have, people black artists who've come up through, have had their own success, their own careers in music, and then have, kind of changed sides as they leave the performance side and get into the business side, and kind of employ the same controls and limitations that we saw, the other, the industry overall, just kind of controlling artists in a way that may or may not have benefited them in the long run, or may not have allowed them to be successful, independently successful, have the same success that they had, and to get to the positions that they are now. But that's really Funky 4+1. Definitely check them out on the timeline, or just, in general, classic MCs in that group. Next, we have Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. And this is where we really see the departure from the sort of block party hip-hop scene to really the innovation and, the DJs really taking the party music scene into the studio, and, utilizing new techniques and, just innovations to really create, the definitive modern hip hop rap sound that we now would associate hip hop or rap with, just because of the increased inclusion of MCs, and MCs kind of having the DJ creating that those beats, producing beats and music that really favors MC more so than the dance party, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But Grandmaster Flash, also known as Joseph Sadler, he was born in Barbados. He grew up in the Bronx, New York, and he grew up listening to jazz records, and that really was the early inspiration, just hearing jazz records. And on top of that, he had early interest in just the development that was going around hip hop, and he was inspired by Pete DJ Jones and of course DJ Kool Herc, and he had the opportunity to attend Samuel Gomper's vocational technical school, and so he got some actual formal training in electronics. And after that, he built a mixing unit which utilized 2 turntables, and he also developed the technique of scratching. And in addition to that, he developed other techniques along the way, like quick mix theory, backspinning, clock theory, all these different pretty well-known DJ techniques. But he was just, once you obviously are able to build your own mixing unit and add that second turntable, you've really put yourself in control and have opened yourself up to all these different techniques, and you add some of the other innovations that we're talking about at this time, and you get the modern DJ essentially. And obviously when you listen to their music, it sounds a lot more simple, maybe a lot more cut and pasty than it does now. But once you really think about what they're working with, and that they're really developing all of this as they go, it's pretty incredible. So in 1976, he worked with Grand Wizard Theodore's Mean Gene Livingston's DJ crew, and that's where he became known as Grandmaster Flash. And he started to work with Cowboy Keith Wiggins and Melly Mel, also known as Melvin Glover, and that was basically his original group. It was like Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Few, I think, I want to say. And then in 1979, he signed with eventually developing his own group and expanding that to 5 rappers. So then it was officially Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, and you add Kid Creole, Daniel Glover into the mix. And so, as I was kind of getting at, when you have the emergence of DJs like Grandmaster Flash, it really shifted the attention from the party that was going on, the B-boys and B-girls, to the DJ, because all of a sudden you have this DJ, of course initially with the block parties, you have kind of the shock factor, you have the DJ, running the show, but now all of a sudden you're employing these techniques and just doing all this madness on stage, and you're going to shift some of that attention to the DJ. And so, he started with the party records, releasing party records, but, with his style, it worked. He felt it worked better with rappers, and, he felt that was almost, in some cases, distracting from the dancing and whatnot, based on what he was doing. So he really developed that DJ relationship with vocalists, slash MCs, and eventually they signed with Sugar Hill Records in 1980. Their first record was a party album, Freedom. They had Freedom and Birthday Party. And then in 1981, they released The Adventures of Grandmaster Flash on the Wheels of Steel, which really showed kind of that evolution of Grandmaster Flash and his abilities on the innovations he was had already created and was working on. It's really, once again, when you listen to it, it does sound like a little bit cut and pasted, kind of like a collage. But when you consider, what a DJ would have to do or a producer would have to do to create that at that time, it's pretty cool. And just considering what else was out, that was really just a new sound, new record, and he had his scratches, all these techniques that were really truly groundbreaking at the time. And then in 1982, as we talked about, this kind of shift to MCs, they released The Message, which is where you see the Furious Five featured, and you can see that the focus is not only on MCs, but just lyrically. You can see the lyrical development from the MCs and the focus, that song specifically on urban social life, social and street issues in life, and it kind of reflects and kind of ties back into the lineage of what we talked about of what this sort of blue lineage type music represents. Even though the sound changes, the message remains the same, and the music itself, of course, follows the same lineage as well. So, that was kind of their pinnacle at the time. Once again, we've talked about a number of artists who, were not necessarily focusing on commercial hits in the timeline. We're really looking at innovation and some of these early artists who just, created and designed the sound. And so this was kind of the pinnacle for them, just because of the diverse interests. You have essentially 6 people, and people who are obviously very creative, really creating the sound as you go. And so in addition to just different views, and also, once again, some barriers and issues like compensation by Sugar Hill Records, they had difficulty keeping that unified focus and goal. And so, they had some court appearances, and eventually the group just mutually went their separate ways to record. And probably, we've probably out of that group, the best known artist and DJ is of course Grandmaster Flash, but also Melly Mel, and we saw them kind of come back and unite at different points of their career to perform. But that's kind of it for the Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, at least for this timeline. But definitely take a look at those those two tracks because I think number one, when you just talk about the instrumentals that Grandmaster Flash was releasing there, super innovative, pretty incredible considering the time and how early it was. And then just when you listen to the message, thinking about how that contrasts to some of the artists and lyrics that we've talked about, and also just when you think about modern content, modern rap, and how it compares there. Certainly, the flow, the lyrical delivery has changed and evolved, but I think the content, and just considering how early it was, it's very very good quality stuff to listen to, very historic and important. So next on the timeline, we have Beat Street. And Beat Street is an interesting entry. Just because it's a movie and it was created and produced by Harry Belafonte and Orion Pictures, which is his film company. And it was initially a failure by the box office, but it became really important, not only here, but especially internationally. And it's really a classic in hindsight, and it's really an important marker of the state of hip-hop at the time. It's kind of almost like a time capsule of what everything looked at in that really early 1980s at this point. And it really, in 1983, a lot of studios took a lot of interest in trying to capitalize on this rapidly increasing interest in hip-hop. They saw Wild Style and Style Wars, two independent films, have a lot of success in that independent film world by critic. Had a really good critic response. And so that led to a lot of studios trying to really rapidly make multiple projects. And I think, that was a good thing, to really capture the movement that was happening. But I think this rush to really kind of capitalize is the key word, to really profit, kind of led to the kind of rushed feelings and uneven plot and what seemed like forced writing at times in these movies, including Beat Street. And even the art, when you look at the movie, it was carefully thought out, and it's supposed to be authentic as far as street art, graph art. But because, the studios kind of turned that from, taking original art and having the studios manufacture it or make it, it really does have a manufactured appeal. And specifically for Beat Street, they actually had Puma. They outfitted the cast. And so that's another thing where, there's a clear commercial interest. The studios are trying to really put all this together and really, I think there was genuine interest, definitely by Harry Belafonte and a lot of these producers to capture this movement, but also, there's definitely a commercial interest where you're, infusing all of these other things into the movie, and it takes away a little bit from the authenticity, I think, of the movie. Beat Street was interesting just because, in addition, that was, you're outfitted with Puma, and the movie itself was centered in the holiday season, winter holidays in Bronx, New York, and it then premieres in the summer of '84. So there's a little bit disconnect there. You're kind of having this loose holiday winter theme, and people are in the theaters in the summer, hot summer, watching this. So there's a little bit disconnect there. If you really wanted to have a full impact, for what the movie was, you probably would want to have a little bit more continuity there between when it was recorded or filmed and when it was released. But regardless, the movie itself, the cameos alone are incredible. I think created a really good snapshot of the time, and they really did try to be authentic and really represent the hip hop community. But you see, people like Kool Herc, Afrika, Bambaataa, Soul Sonic Force, Jazzy J, Melly Mel, and the rest of the Furious Five, the Rocksteady crew, Dougie Fresh, and we in the movie you see Rocksteady crew versus New York City Breakers, which was a really cool crew duel in the film. It was probably one of the better performances or highlights of the film. But there were other pretty notable performances, and even though it doesn't necessarily all go together sometimes, the performance individually were still pretty good. They were still snapshots, even though they definitely could have been better or captured better. It's still a great, like I said, almost time capsule of the times. And the graphic writers, Phase 2 and Blast, were also brought in as artist consultants. As I said before, they wanted to have that authenticity in that respect. But once again, there was a little bit of something was lost in translation between the authentic art and what was produced by the studios. But once again, the focus here is just the attention to detail and the intent of it. And they had Arthur Baker handle the music, the soundtrack. And like I said, even though it didn't do well in the box office, what followed after that initial release, the media exposure, and it was very successful in the movie rental market, and eventually got very popular, and it aged much better than some of the other movies. Like a lot of people will compare it to Breakin', which saw a lot more initial success, but over time, Beat Street definitely aged better, and that focus on authenticity really paid off in the end. Because if you watch Breakin' now, it seems a little bit almost cheesy, a little bit fake-ish, in comparison to Beat Street, in my opinion. And it was, important in hindsight, but as was also not currently, but at the time, it was very important in popularizing hip-hop culture in Europe. Because now all of a sudden the international community was able to see hip-hop culture. We've talked about music and some of the artists, U.S. artists, traveling around to Europe and different parts of the world and spreading music that way. And obviously records and whatnot are internationally released now. But the visuals, the ability to see what hip-hop culture, and this is very important because especially when you get into funk, and now when you get into hip-hop culture, you talk about the importance of the actual cultural identity, that the important visuals that kind of go along with that. With funk, it was more of, like we said before, was more of a personal movement. It was more of a movement for the black community, even though it did have a lot of international success. It did help connect the black community to Africa and other African cultures of African descent. But now, you're able to really see it through movie. There's very limited ability for international communities to really have a visual of this hip-hop movement and everything that was going on as far as the art and the dance and all of that. And so now, you have a whole movie that, theoretically captures what was going on pretty well. You have to remember that, this is before MTV was just starting, and there was a delay in having, non-pop black artists, as we kind of already discussed, on MTV, and there weren't really other programs that would have reached those communities in that way. and especially beyond just concert performances. When you're really getting into the actual culture, like what hip hop meant, in New York and these other communities. And so I think, it might not be super important to the listeners of this podcast just because there's kind of inherent knowledge for many of us, but just kind of recognizing what Beat Street meant to the whole greater movement as far as kind of popularizing it beyond the United States, and also popularizing it for other communities that did not have access to the music. And that was one of the reasons why it was so successful in the rental market, just because you have to remember with the box office, depending where it was, when you have one or two screens or fewer screens to view a movie, you're going to have some picking and choosing depending on the market what's played. So the rental market, of course, we've kind of talked about that there was a great interest in some of these different sounds, whether they acquired it through mixtapes or through these other sort of secondary markets. And that was kind of the way that hip hop in general kind of spread throughout the United States and beyond, for some of these listeners who didn't have access to the sort of urban community landscape where it was going on. So that's Beat Street. And to close the timeline, we have kind of an interesting decision with Unity, which was a song / video, eventually became a music video. And it's more symbolic than anything when you talk about the title Unity. It's kind of ironic in some ways because as far as everything we've talked about, as far as Black American music history goes, Unity was a song by James Brown and Afrika Bambaataa, and both of these legends are huge innovators in the music as far as music goes, but they're also steeped with controversy, and in many ways they became kind of products of the music industry, as we've talked about, at least with James Brown. We didn't really get into Afrika Bambaataa, but in the end, you still have to recognize their contribution for what it was. And I think in this case, just focusing on the song and video in particular, this of course was the end of the funk era. We saw a lot of shift in politics at this time, and we saw that this also kind of represented the close of many of the Black social movements that we talked about in the 1970s and 1980s that aligned with the funk and early hip hop scenes. And we saw a lot of the social reforms and the social progress that kind of aligned with this. This kind of marked a decline or closing of that. And even though that ended, these social issues, really remained with this growing narrative of the model Black family or citizen versus the crime and drug use that later drove like the crime bills and crack epidemic that of course took place soon after. So you can see this shift. Of course, James Brown is one of the innovators of funk, and Afrika Bambaataa is one of the early hip-hop artists. And this video was a landmark as far as the first real official collaboration between James Brown and another hip-hop artist. And when you listen to the song, the music itself has a positive music, but it feels a little bit curated and crafted. I think certainly when you listen to it now, it kind of sounds like a song that you might like listen to in school or something. It has very clear, the themes are clear. It's all about peace, love, and unity, and having fun. That's like the whole theme of the song. And so it doesn't really address the other structures or the other things the other barriers it's kind of like, anyone can do this or accomplish this if they want to. That's kind of the vibe that you get from that song. But the song does at the same time contain references to past movements and pay homage to some of, like James Brown's songs. And, you have to wonder how much of this content really was to kind of pull James Brown into the project and not necessarily, produce a commercial or real genuine hit. It was more of just a kind of a, I don't want to say a marketing stunt, but if it was more about the appearance and kind of the theme more so than the actual content of the song and music. But I think it's probably in poor taste to criticize this last entry of the timeline or take a negative stance, because I think overall the song is very positive. I think it definitely successfully spreads the message of unity, and it really marks, I think, the beginning of a new era. You can think of it as a marking of the end of an era, and that's one of the reasons why you should, number one, listen to the song. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's the final entry of the timeline, just because we have hip hop. We're probably certainly can argue that we're still in this hip hop era or rap era, depending. Some people would say that hip hop is dead. I don't necessarily take that stance, but some people will take that stance. And it's hip hop is definitely has evolved. Rap has evolved. Some people will say for the better, some people will say for the worse. But as I was saying earlier, the lyrical delivery, the beats, the technology employed, and the way artists integrate other genres and other subgenres and types of music definitely has enriched and changed hip hop / rap. But I think that you can definitely make the argument that we're still in this era, and from the social and cultural standpoint, it's hard to say that we've really moved forward or moved on from this. So the main takeaway from this ending, from this being the final entry of the timeline, is just to show that we're in this hip hop era, kind of a close of the funk era, and that political and social shift where we're saying, before this we were really in a movement where the black community was really in a position to thrive, and parts of it continued to thrive, but we saw a change of stance in the politics, and some of these social movements kind of faded away, and we kind of saw this message that similar to unity, where it's in some ways it felt manufactured, where now the black community had made it, and it was just a matter of focusing on these themes: peace, love, and unity, and having fun, and everything would be okay. And I think that can resonate with a lot of people during that time and following that time, who would say that there's still a long way to go. These social movements still had a lot of merit, and perhaps there was other things at play, including the music industry, that was kind of trying to focus and extract this commercial component, the business side of hip hop and what was happening there, and really transforming into the music we know today, where people who are critics, people always say rock is dead, hip hop is dead, and I think a lot of that comes from just the change of, as we've talked about, the shift of focus from the artist to the industry, which is unfortunately in some cases really kind of robbed audiences from that authenticity and that message that comes from the artist, the artist's pen and instrument and writing. and their actual core message is kind of distorted in the process as far as getting it to the listener and getting to that final product, that final record. How long the records are, how long how long not only how long the records are, but how long each track is. What is the financial payoff for having a longer track versus a shorter track? Those type of things, and also, of course, we've talked about some of the friction that occurs between artists and these labels and just the business in general, and the ability to make money and continue to make money as an artist in the industry. When you have a lot of these large music and record companies, kind of commanding and dictating, and get a lot of bloat as far as administrative staff and all these other components, legal components. All of this, can cost money and can take away from the art. And we talked about with the Motown era how it was almost very mechanical in some respects, as far as having a team of writers, a house band, and really trying to produce, find a formula and continue to produce it, replicate it, and just have success from that. And that's kind of how the industry has grown and continued to grow. But with that said, we still have a lot of these artists who are continuing to innovate. We have, with the internet and other things, we have, a thriving independent, underground scene. And, by no means is this supposed to be the end of music, of course, or the end of time. The timeline does not mark the end of good music. There's a lot of areas where you can criticize, where music has gone and where it's going, but there's a lot of bright spots. There's, like I said, there's clearly, if you look around, there's a lot of innovators and, musicians who are able to, really survive and thrive independently, utilizing, other methods that were previously unavailable, like, just using YouTube and, some of these streaming services in some cases, and, just other avenues are opening up. So, we'll see where it goes, and, that's really a discussion for another episode, I think. But, by no means is this ending date, supposed to represent anything more than kind of this last innovation of what I just talked about. And as I said before, how we'll continue this project is kind of up in the air. We have the timeline in place. We've broken down, what this blue lineage represents, what the timeline represents. All of these different artists, and all these different inventions, technology, these social movements and political movements that correspond and align with everything that was going on in the development of these different genres. And so, of course, we still have, blues, R&B, rock, funk, and hip-hop today. And hip-hop is, of course, the most recent. And, we'll see. I think that, we'll talk about it another episode. I'm not trying to get into the final discussion, the outro. I don't want to get too into that. But we covered everything that we needed to in this episode, and we got to Unity, the end of the timeline, 1984. Like I said, next week there will be a bonus episode that was previously recorded. It's kind of a side project, a little bit of a kind of go on. It's a little bit different. It covers the entirety of the timeline, but adds in a little bit of an additional discussion that you'll see. And then after that, we'll have the outro and the final discussion, and then we'll see. As I said before, there's a lot of different ways that we can put out content about current, and future artists that we'd like to focus on, and different subjects and current events that are happening there's a lot of different ways to do it, and podcast is only one. So, I'll talk about it again in the final episode, but, feel free, please reach out with any ideas, or if you have anything that, you felt that wasn't covered or would like to cover more in depth. I know personally that there's a lot of different stuff that, more in depth and more events that could have been talked about and can be talked about. And I'm really open. It's the project is really supposed to be more of a community-driven project, and I've appreciated all the feedback and ideas so far, and it's really open. I think that diving deep into the history of this lineage was important because it's not necessarily something that is assembled this way. A lot of times we might talk about an individual genre, we might talk about rock, that's rock and funk combined. We might talk about rock and kind of that rock history, who are the artists that contributed to it, where did it go, and you don't necessarily put it all together this way. You don't necessarily include the innovations that contributed or the artists, from the beginning who have really set the stage for rock. And of course, a lot of the artists that we talked about are really not well known, but were also core contributors, and also where it goes. You can get in when you get into these genres like rock or something. You can get in the subgenres. You can get kind of lost in all of that. And so it's not to take away from any of those other components or subgenres, but the Blue Lineage was really to kind of streamline and focus on these elements of what represent Black American music from the standpoint of the blues. And so that's really that. And they all still exist today. You can argue that there's if you take R&B, of course there's neo soul, there's modern R&B, and it sounds much different than the R&B that we talked about early in the timeline compared to the more modern R&B artists and of course the current artists. So you can talk about it all day, but really this is the core structure, and where we go from here is it's really up to you. So I always appreciate feedback, ideas, and we'll see where it goes. But hope you tune into the next bonus episode, and I look forward to closing this out and hearing from all of you. Thanks for listening again. I'll see you next time.